My daughter handed me a glass of wine at exactly 7 o'clock that evening, smiled the way she always did when she wanted something, and said, "We need to talk after dinner, Dad." I remember thinking she looked too calm, too rehearsed. I had been reading people for 40 years in business, and I knew the difference between nervous calm and prepared calm. My daughter was prepared. I just didn't know yet how many people had helped her prepare. It was the night of my 62nd birthday. My wife had insisted on a dinner at the private room of a restaurant in Oakville that I had never particularly liked, but had stopped saying so somewhere around our 20th anniversary. There were candles on the table and a cake I hadn't asked for, and 43 years of marriage sitting between us like something neither of us was willing to move. My son had driven up from Hamilton with his wife, who had never once called me anything other than Richard in a tone that suggested the name itself was an inconvenience. My daughter had come with her partner, a man who sold financial products he didn't fully understand and gave advice nobody had asked for. My wife was wearing a dress I'd bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. That detail stayed with me afterward, the way small things do when everything else falls apart. The dinner was fine, the kind of fine that happens when a family has agreed in advance to behave until the right moment. We talked about the grandchildren and the weather and whether the highway construction on the QEW would ever actually finish. I ordered the salmon. I remember the salmon specifically because I barely touched it. I had noticed something by then. The way my son kept glancing at his phone under the table. The way my wife refilled her wine twice without looking at me. The way my daughter kept her hand flat on the table as though steadying herself. I had spent enough time in boardrooms to know what a coalition looked like, and I was looking at one now. When the cake came out, I blew out the candles. My wife took a photograph. My son started a small round of applause that his wife joined and my daughter joined and my son-in-law joined, all of it slightly off tempo, the way people clap when they're thinking about what comes next, rather than what's happening now. And then my wife reached into her handbag, placed an envelope on the table between us, and slid it toward me the way you slide a document across a desk at the end of a negotiation you've already won. She said, "I think we both know this is the right time." I looked at the envelope. I looked at my children. My son had put his phone away. My daughter was looking at her hands. My son-in-law was studying the ceiling with enormous interest. And I understood then very clearly that this dinner had not been a celebration. It had been a staging ground. I had been the only person at my own birthday party who didn't know what the party was actually for. I picked up the envelope, excused myself from the table, and walked to the men's room. I stood at the sink for a long moment and looked at myself in the mirror. 62 years old, gray at the temples, which I'd earned, lines around the eyes, which I'd earned twice over. I opened the envelope. The lawyer's letterhead was from a firm in downtown Toronto, one of the ones with 3 surnames on the door that charge you just for opening the file. The papers were thorough. I gave them credit for that. They had been working on this for a while. I folded the papers carefully, put them back in the envelope, washed my hands, and returned to the table. My wife asked if I was all right. I said, the salmon was overcooked. I signed nothing that night. I asked for the bill, paid it, thanked the staff, wished my grandchildren a happy month since I wouldn't see them at their usual Sunday visits for a while, and drove home alone because my wife had arrived separately and left separately, which I only realized after I was already on the lakeshore. What my wife did not know, what none of them knew, was that I had been waiting for something like this for almost 3 years. I want to be honest about something, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I am not a man who was blindsided. I am a man who saw clearly and chose not to look directly at what he saw for a very long time. I had built Bennett Structural Group from a single estimating contract in 1987 into a mid-sized construction management firm with offices in Toronto, Ottawa, and Calgary. I had worked 14-hour days through my children's school plays and my wife's mother's illness and every Christmas that mattered and several that didn't. I had built something real. But I had also made the mistake that a certain kind of man makes when he is very good at one thing. I had assumed that providing everything was the same as being present for everything. Those are not the same thing. I know that now. I knew it earlier than I admitted. My son had never held a job longer than 14 months. He was 34 years old and had lived in the house in Hamilton that I owned and had always somehow forgotten to actually charge rent on. He had an MBA from a school I'd paid for, and had used it primarily to have opinions at dinner about industries he'd never worked in. My daughter was 31, and her partnership with her financial products boyfriend was funded, as most things in her life had been funded, by the joint account I maintained for her that I had originally set up for emergencies and had gradually become her operating budget. I had done this. I had made it easy, and then made it easier, and then one day looked up and found that what I had created was not a family so much as a set of financial dependencies that had learned, over time, to resent the source. My wife had not worked since 1994. I don't say that as an accusation. She had raised our children and managed our home and been a capable and present parent in ways I had not always been. But somewhere in the last decade, something had shifted. I wasn't sure when. I remembered noticing, around 2019, that she had begun referring to the house as her house, in conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear, and sometimes in ones I was. I remembered the first time I heard her on the phone with my daughter discussing what the house might be worth, as though I were a variable in an equation rather than the man who had bought it and paid it off and repainted the trim every 4 years. What I had done quietly and without drama was protect myself. In the spring of 2021, I sold Bennett Structural Group, not quickly and not carelessly. I sold it to a private equity firm out of Calgary for a number I was satisfied with, and I structured the sale in a way that my personal lawyer, a patient and thorough man named Gerald, who had been with me since the early 90s, had recommended over several long conversations. The sale proceeds went not to me personally, but to a holding company that Gerald and I had incorporated 3 years earlier for exactly this purpose. The holding company owned the real estate. It held the investment accounts. It carried the lines of credit my family used for their various lifestyles. My name was in the holding company. My wife's name was not. Neither were my children's. This was not cruelty. I want to be very clear about that. Gerald had advised me on this, not because I anticipated a divorce, but because he had seen, in 40 years of practice, what happened to men who retired without structure, who left their assets naked, who got to 65 and found that 30 years of building could be dismantled in a single courthouse afternoon. The holding company was not a weapon. It was a foundation. The fact that it later turned out to be useful in a different way than I had originally intended was simply a coincidence that I had, admittedly, been quietly prepared for. The morning after my birthday dinner, I called Gerald. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always valued about him. When I finished, he said, "How are you feeling about this?" I said, "I'd like to move forward with the restructuring we discussed." He said, "I'll have the paperwork ready by Thursday." My wife's lawyer sent a formal notice 3 days later. By then, Gerald had already begun the process. The holding company assets were consolidated. The joint account I maintained for my daughter was closed, with a letter explaining that the account had reached the end of its administrative cycle, which was technically accurate and also irrelevant. The supplementary credit card on my account that my son had been using for 17 years, the one with the $15,000 limit that he had treated as something between an allowance and a birthright, was canceled. The property management company that handled the Hamilton house received instructions to begin a formal tenancy assessment, which was the first step toward issuing a proper lease agreement, or, if that proved unwelcome, a notice to vacate. I did not do any of this from anger. I want to be clear about that too. I had been angry at some earlier point in this story, I think, but by the time I was sitting in Gerald's office on a Thursday afternoon in October, I was something past anger. I was simply someone who had decided to stop pretending that things were other than what they were. My son called me on a Friday. I let it go to voicemail. The message said, "Dad, there's something wrong with the card. Can you call me back?" My daughter texted that same afternoon, "Dad, the account says closed? What's going on?" My wife called through her lawyer, which told me everything I needed to know about the state of communication in our marriage. I called my son back on Saturday morning because I had thought carefully about what I wanted to say, and I wanted to say it clearly and without heat. He answered on the first ring. I said, "The card is canceled. That account is closed permanently." He said, "What? Why?" "Dad, I've got bills due. I said, "I know." There was a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then he said, "Is this because of Mom?" I said, "This is because I sold my company 2 years ago, and I should have had this conversation then. I'm having it now. He said, Dad, you can't just... I said, I can, and I have. What happens next is up to you. I hung up. Not rudely, just completely. My son-in-law called 2 hours later. He introduced himself by his first name as though I might have forgotten who he was, which I found inadvertently funny, and noted that he had clearly been selected as the family's negotiator, presumably because he worked in financial services, and assumed that gave him standing in a conversation about finances that involved someone else's money entirely. He said, Richard, I think there's been some miscommunication. The family is concerned. I said, My daughter has my number. He said, She's upset. She doesn't want to. I said, My daughter has my number. He said, Richard, this feels very... I said, I have another call. Goodbye. The next 3 weeks were the noisiest of my life, and also, strangely, some of the quietest. Noisy because my phone did not stop. Quiet because I had rented a small furnished apartment in Burlington, nothing extravagant, 2 bedrooms, a decent view of the escarpment, and I was living in it alone for the first time in decades, and the silence of a space that was entirely my own was something I had forgotten was possible. I drank my coffee in the morning without anyone needing anything from me. I read the papers I hadn't read in years. I walked by the lake in the evenings with no particular destination. I slept 8 hours, which I had not done consistently since approximately 1998. The divorce proceedings moved forward. My wife's lawyer was thorough and aggressive, and clearly expected to find the kind of asset portfolio that belongs to a man who has just sold a successful company. What they found instead was a holding company with Gerald's name on the directorship and a corporate structure that was fully legal, fully documented, and fully impenetrable by the methods they were applying. My wife was entitled to a division of what was legally matrimonial property under Ontario family law. Gerald had spent 3 years ensuring that the definition of matrimonial property, as it applied to my situation, was considerably narrower than my wife's lawyer had assumed. I want to say something here that I think matters. My wife was not left without resources. That was never what this was. She received a settlement that was fair according to what the law defined as fair, and Gerald ensured that the process was clean and correct, and that no judge would have reason to look twice at it. She received the family home on Morrison Road that we had lived in for 26 years, which had no mortgage and a current valuation that was comfortable. She received a lump sum that would keep her well for the rest of her life if she was sensible with it, which she might or might not choose to be. What she did not receive was the company sale proceeds, the investment portfolio, or the retirement accounts, because those had never been matrimonial property in the way she had spent 3 years assuming they would be. My daughter came to see me in November, not by appointment, which I respected more than a formal visit would have been. She showed up at the Burlington apartment on a Tuesday evening with her coat pulled tight and her eyes red-rimmed, and I let her in and made tea and sat across from her at the small kitchen table. She said, I didn't know it would go this far. I said, What did you think would happen? She looked at her tea. She said, I thought you and Mom would just sort it out. I thought... She stopped. I thought there would be more. I said, More what? She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, More of everything. For all of us. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. The birthday dinner. Were you part of the plan? She didn't say no immediately. That was her answer. I said, How long had you known? She said, A few months. I said, And you didn't tell me. She said, Mom asked me not to. I nodded. I understood the loyalty, and I didn't understand it at the same time. I said, Okay. And then I said, I'm not going to cut you out of my life. I want you to know that. But I also need you to understand that the way things were before the account, the float, the safety net, that's not coming back. Not because I don't love you, because it was making you into someone I don't think you actually want to be. She started crying then, and I let her cry. And I didn't try to fix it because some things need to be felt rather than fixed. She left around 9 o'clock. At the door, she hugged me with the kind of full-weight hug that she hadn't given me since she was about 14 years old. I stood in the hallway after she left and held on to that for a minute before I went back inside. My son took longer. He had been cycling through stages: anger, then bargaining, then what I can only describe as performative helplessness. And he arrived at the apartment 3 weeks after my daughter, unannounced in the same way but with a different energy, tightly wound, hands in his pockets, jaw set. He said, "The property management company sent us a formal notice." I said, "I know. I instructed them to." He said, "Dad, we live there." I said, "You've been living there at no cost for 4 years. The notice gives you 60 days to establish a lease at fair market rent or to make other arrangements." He said, "That's..." He stopped. He tried again. "We can't afford..." I said, "Then that's a problem you'll need to solve." He said, "You're punishing us because of the divorce." I said, "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm stopping something I should have stopped much earlier. I have to own that. I let this go on too long because it was easier than having the conversation, and I'm sorry for that. But I'm not going to keep doing the same thing because stopping it is uncomfortable." He looked at me with something in his face that I couldn't entirely read. It was somewhere between genuine hurt and the particular frustration of someone who has just discovered that the rope they've been climbing hand over hand for 30 years doesn't actually go anywhere they thought it did. He said, "So, what are we supposed to do?" I said, "Figure it out. I believe you can." He left without the hug. That was all right. I hadn't expected one. What happened over the following 4 months was not a straight line, and I don't want to tell it as though it was. My son found a position with a project management firm in Hamilton, a mid-level role that was several levels below what his self-image had told him he deserved, and he took it because the alternative was a conversation with the property management company that he clearly didn't want to have. He negotiated a lease at fair market rent on the Hamilton house, which I agreed to because Gerald advised it was cleaner than forcing a sale on a market that was soft that quarter. My son-in-law's career in financial products did not survive the loss of the supplementary income that my daughter had been providing to the household, and he found work at a credit union in Mississauga that was stable, if unremarkable. My daughter began working again for the first time in several years, doing bookkeeping for small businesses, which was something she had studied and abandoned, and turned out to be genuinely good at when she gave it the attention it required. My wife moved into the Morrison Road house full-time. We communicated through Gerald and through her lawyer and, occasionally, through brief and civil text messages about administrative matters. I did not feel the things I had expected to feel about the end of a 43-year marriage. I felt something quieter, something that took me a while to identify. I think what I felt was that I had been grieving it for a long time already, and that the formal end of it was not the beginning of the loss but the acknowledgement of something that had been ending for years without anyone saying so aloud. In February, my son called me on a Saturday morning, not about the house or the card or the account. He called to tell me that his daughter, my granddaughter, had lost her first tooth, and that she had told him to make sure Grandpa knew. I listened to that for a moment with my coffee going cold on the kitchen counter. I said, "Tell her I'll come see her next week." He said, "She'd like that." There was a pause, not a hostile one. Then he said, "I'm figuring it out, Dad." I said, "I know you are." He said, "It's harder than I thought it would be." I said, "Most things worth doing are." He said, "Is that something your dad used to say?" I said, "No. Your dad used to say it, though, when he was paying more attention." He laughed. Not a big laugh, a small, real one. The kind that means something precisely because it isn't performed. By March, the divorce was finalized. Gerald called me on a Wednesday to confirm. I thanked him, and he said something about golf when the weather improved, and I said I'd take him up on that, and I meant it. The apartment in Burlington was never meant to be permanent. I had known that when I took it. In April, I bought a property outside of Elora, a century farmhouse on 12 acres that needed real work. The kind of work you can only do if you're willing to be uncomfortable with it for a while, which suited me well. The house had a wood stove and original pine floors, and a back field that ran down to a creek lined with willows that were just starting to bud when I first walked the property with the realtor. I stood at the back fence looking at those willows and thought about everything I had spent 40 years building, and everything I was going to spend the next chapter doing differently. I called my daughter from the driveway of the farmhouse after I signed the papers. I told her I'd bought a property in Wellington County. I told her there was a second bedroom when she wanted to visit. She said, "Is it nice?" I said, "It's a disaster. I love it." She laughed, and it was her real laugh, the one I remembered from when she was 12 years old, and something genuinely caught her off guard. She said, "Dad, I'm sorry for the birthday thing, for not telling you." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have." I said, "I know. We're past it." She said, "Are we?" I said, "We are if we decide to be." She said she'd come up in June, when the fields were green. I told her to bring the grandchildren. She said she would. I drove out to Elora in my truck with the windows down because the weather had finally turned, one of those April evenings in southern Ontario when the air is cold and clean and smells like thawed ground and possibility, the kind of evening that makes it very difficult to believe that anything is entirely finished. I had a podcast on and then turned it off because the sound of the road was enough. I thought about my father, who had worked 35 years at a paper mill in Salt Sweet, Marie, and retired on a pension that just covered the necessities, and never once seemed to believe this was less than what he deserved. I thought about the 40 years I had spent building something he never could have, and whether I had been grateful enough for the distance between his life and mine. I thought about my son calling to tell me about a lost tooth on a Saturday morning, and how that phone call was more valuable than any of the transactions that had preceded it. I think about the birthday dinner sometimes. The prepared smiles, the off-tempo applause, the envelope sliding across the white tablecloth. I don't think about it with bitterness, which surprised me because for a long time I expected to. I think about it the way you think about a turning point you almost missed, with something that's more like relief than anything else. My wife had made a decision, and it had forced me to make a decision. And both of those decisions, taken together, had led to something that was more honest than what we'd had before. I'm not sure that's the ending anyone planned for. I'm not sure endings go the way anyone plans. What I know is this. I am 60, 2 years old, and I am driving through Wellington County with the windows down and 12 acres of century farmhouse waiting for me at the end of the road, and the creek at the back of the property runs fast in spring, and the willows are budding, and my granddaughter lost her first tooth, and Gerald is already talking about golf. There are worse foundations to build from. There are much, much worse places to begin.